Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in our tutorial series where we take a look at how the Spring Boot can be combined together with Angular. As you can probably remember, in the previous video we have created our AbstractCRUDL API and we defined some methods, but we are still not using them. In this video we are going to do exactly that. We are going to create some abstract service where we are going to implement these methods, and we are going to be using them also in the type specific service. For example, in our case that would be the vehicle service that we are going to create. Also, one thing that I did change from the last video is I just added some comments on all of these methods so that it's a bit clearer what they do. Okay, so let's get started. Let's create our AbstractCRUDL service. This is where our majority of our logic is going to be contained. So it's going to be a really interesting video for you probably. So let's start with creating a new package, and in that package a new Java class, an abstract class called AbstractCRUDLService. And here we have our AbstractCRUDLService, and we created a service package where we are going to be placing all of our services that we are going to have in the future. Of course, we are going to define our types. So we have the entity type, which is extending the distributed entity, and we have our DTO, which extends the base DTO. Now, once you have that, we want to implement our AbstractCRUDL API. Great. With that being done, we're going to start think about our constructor. There are a few things that we want to handle here. So inside of this service, we are going to be using all of the things that we have previously created, like the converters and repositories and stuff like that. So we want to also inject that. So let's create our constructor first. So here we have our repository that we are going to be injecting, and we also have our converter. We also want to create properties in this class so that we can assign these two, these two components that are being injected. Great. So with this being done, we want to take care of also one more thing. We're going to be needing the class of our entity. To get that, we are going to be using the generic type resolver, which can help us to resolve the type arguments from our class. So from this class, we are going to be having a possibility to resolve the class of the entity that we are passing in. So let me just implement that. Currently, we will not be using it, but later on we are going to need it for something, and I will be explaining you in a few minutes why we need this. And here we have it. So from the type arguments, we are taking the first one, which is in our case the entity, and from the entity we are taking the class and storing it inside of this entity class property. Great. Now with that being done, we are ready to do some implementation. So all of these methods that we have created previously in our AbstractCRUDL API, like the save method and the rest of them, we are going to implement them now. One thing that we can do in IntelliJ, so this is really optional, we can add these kind of comments so that they will later help us to collapse some of the regions. So like you can split your class into regions. So let's see how that looks like. So here it is. It's actually quite nice to have it, so you can collapse part of your code. So for easier, so that you can easily read the class and see what you have inside. It's really helpful for bigger classes that our AbstractCRUDL service will probably become in the future. So we might start it from the beginning. So let's implement all of the methods that we have from the AbstractCRUDL API. So here they are. We have our save method, we have the getById, we have our list method, and we have our delete method. So we can start with something simple. Let's start with get by ID method. So the get by ID method is, yeah, it explains it. You can see it by yourself. It's actually quite simple. You're interested in finding something by ID. To do that, we are going to be using our repository. We're going to pass in the integer ID, and then with the repository, we're going to look in our database, see if we can find an entity with that ID. If yes, return it. If not, we're going to return null. We're going to create also another region, so like a helper region, where we can put some helper methods. And for the first method in this region, we are going to implement a method that will be interacting with our repository. I'm just doing this because I know that we are in the future, we are going to be using this method in a couple of other places, not just in the get by ID method. So just so that we don't repeat ourselves. And here we have it. It's actually quite simple. We're using our repository that's injected here, so our distributed repository, to find an entity by ID, and otherwise we're just returning null. This find by ID method is coming from the cradle repository, so there is an implementation behind it. So it's not one of our methods. We are, since in our repository we're extending some different ones, and we're just reusing that, so we don't need to implement anything manually for ourselves. Okay, great. Now with that being done, we actually want to implement this method. And also one thing that we might want to do immediately is to introduce a logger, so that we can have some nice logs, and later on we can actually take a look at them and see how they look like. So let me just create one logger for us. And here we have it. We are using the logger factory to create a logger for this class. And later on we can take a look, for example, how we can use these logs to put them in Elasticsearch and maybe query them in Kibana or something like that. But for now, they will just be appearing for us in the console. So let's get back to the implementation of the getById method. The first thing that we want to do is we want to call our findEntityById method here. So we are calling findEntityById and we are returning this entity. But keep in mind that it also can be null in some cases. For example, when this entity does not exist in a database, or with some invalid ID if we are searching with it. And in that case, we probably want to log some error. So let's see how we can do that. And now you can see what we are doing. If the entity is null, we are logging an error and just returning that null. And in the case where we actually have an entity, we want to convert it to a DTO. So we are using the converter that we have also injected up above. And the convert method we saw in the previous videos, how we can implement them. For example, for vehicle, it looks like this. We have our super class where we have the base convert method, which just converts the base and base properties, and then the type specific implementation is done in the type specific converter, like in this case the vehicle converter. And for example, for vehicles, this converter would be of type vehicle converter. For, I don't know, users, it would be of user converter and stuff like that. So it's really generic and can be reused by many entities. Perfect. So now that we saw how we can do that, let's see how we can find a list of entities. For example, that's something that would be interesting for us. So we are going to take a look at that. Also, as in the previous method, we are also going to create a new helper method, which is going to be called getEtios. In which we are going to use functionality of our converter to convert a list of found entities. So let me just implement the method and then we can take a look how what does it do. And here it is. It's a quite simple method to which we pass in a list of entities. If they're empty, we just return immediately an empty list. And otherwise, we are using our convert list method to convert those entities into etios and then return them. So it's quite simple. So let's take a look at how are we going to use this. We are going to go back to our list method, and the first thing that we want to do is we want to use the find all method from our repository. So here we have the list of our entities, and with that we want to pass them into the get etios method. So maybe we can do that immediately here. Yeah, so it's actually quite simple, and we can copy this and paste it here, so we can get rid of this, and that's it. We are using the, again, already implemented method, so not ours, it's from one of the repositories that we are extending. We are using that method with our repository to find all of the entities. Then we are doing our conversion, and we are converting them to etios and returning them. If there are no entities, we are just returning an empty list. Great, so our list method is quite simple. Maybe we can now take a look at how we can delete entity. So for example, the first thing that you want to do when deleting an entity, you want to try to find it, check if it even exists. As before, we are going to use this find entity by ID method, which we can basically just copy from here, and we can paste this here. So again, we are looking for an entity with an ID that we are passing in, and if it's null, we are logging an error. And maybe we can just change the message so that we know that this is in case of the deletion. So we are saying that we failed to delete an entity with an ID, blah blah, as it does not exist. Great, but now in the case where it does exist, we want to delete it. And let me just implement it really fast, and then we can go over it and I can tell you what we exactly did. So here it is. We are using the repository delete method to which we pass in our entity. And as you can see in the simple JPA repository, this method is implemented. It has some logic inside, so it's not something that we have implemented. So it handles some things for us. And if it was successfully deleted, so if no exceptions have been thrown, we just return true. And actually I see here a problem. We should return false here, as we have failed to delete the entity. So in this case, we are returning true, and in case where there was some exception, we log that exception and we return false, as we did not delete the entity. Great. We have managed to do many things, but we still didn't take a look at how we can save our entity. So let's go to that one. It's also not that much complicated, but yeah, we have to take a look at how we can do this. One thing that we want to change here is we want to update our DTO class. So our base DTO class, let's go to it. We want to be able to know if this DTO, so if this entity is just being created or it already exists. We can know that if the ID is set. So if the ID is set, the entity is an older entity that already existed, as it has an ID. If it doesn't have an ID, that means that it's just created. So let's create a new method called isNew, which would just return true if this entity is new and false otherwise. Yeah, quite simple. And here it is. It's a really simple method. We are just checking if the ID is set or not. So if it's null, that means that the entity is new. And also we have @JSON_ignore because we don't want this method to appear in our DTO when we send it to the front end. So we're just excluding it really fast. Okay, so let's go back to our cradle service. What do we want to do here? we want to, when saving an entity, we want to tell the difference in between the entity that we are saving for the first time and entity that we are updating. So that's where this isNew comes into the play. So we want to, in the case where it's new, we need to initialize this entity. So we need to create a helper method that's going to do exactly that. And for that, we are going to be using the entity class that we have here. So let's go to our region, to our helper region, and let's create a method that will be able to initialize an entity. I will be explaining everything afterwards after we have implemented it. So here it is. We have implemented our init entity method, which we are using in which we are using the entity class to create a new instance of our entity. As you can see, this method is deprecated, so we have to think about how we can replace this. We'll not do it in this video, so we'll do it in some other one. So for now, we're just going to be using it. It won't hurt us. And you can see that I'm already setting the created timestamp for this entity, because at this moment, this would be the time when this entity was created, and we want to set it immediately. And once we have created it, we are just returning it here. And in case of some errors, we're just returning null and yeah, logging them. So let's go back to our save method and let's do the implementation of how we can initialize this entity. And here it is. So in case where our DTO is new, which means that this DTO was just sent from the front end, we are trying to create it. We initialize our entity. And in the case where we have the ID, we use our find entity by ID method to fetch the entity from the database and assign it here. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to log some exceptions in case if the entity is still null. So in the case if the entity is still null, we are just logging the error message here with the simple name of the entity class, and we return null. Okay, now the next thing is we want to set the modified timestamp. So that's something that's being done now. We are modifying our entity, and also in the case where we are just creating it for the first time, the modified timestamp will be quite close to the created timestamp. And with that being done, we want to also save our entity. To do that, we are just going to use our repository. And with the repository, we also get back the save entity, so we can call it with saved entity, and let me just make this final. And to return it, as we are not going to be returning the entity itself, we're going to return the DTO, so like the saved DTO, we're going to use our converter to convert it. One thing that maybe you have noticed is that once we are setting the modified timestamp here and also created timestamp and basically everything that is a base of our entity. So like if we go to our entity here, so our distributed entity, you can see that we have created timestamp, modified timestamp. The ID will be auto-generated, so we don't have to worry about that. But if we had other properties here, we would also be setting them here. But what about properties like that we have on our vehicle? So like the number, who will set this? Like if you send the number from the front end in our DTO and you call the save method, where do you set that number to the entity to save it to the database? That's where our generics get a bit more complicated, or not that much complicated, but just a little bit. We are going to create a new method. We can actually put it here on top. It's going to be an abstract method that's going to be implemented in the type specific services. So let's take a look at how that will look like. So it's going to be called update entity, and it's used to update all of the properties that are type specific, so that are not common. And we are going to be calling it before we save the entity, so somewhere here. To it, we just provide our entity and the DTO. Let me just add some comments here so that it's a bit clear what we are doing. Okay, great. So we are doing all of the good things here, and now we can move away from our AbstractCRUDLService and we can go to our type specific service, so we can actually implement this class. So let's take a look how that would look like for our vehicle. So let's create a vehicle service. In our vehicle service, we are going to do a few things. We are going to annotate it with @service. So just so the Spring knows that this is our service, we are going to extend the AbstractCRUDLService. And our entity is going to be, of course, vehicle. And the DTO is the vehicle DTO. So with that being done, we are ready to implement our vehicle API. And now we want to implement some method, which is our update entity method. And in addition, we need to create our, so we need a constructor. So let me just, here we need a constructor that matches the one in the superclass. So we need a repository and we need a converter. For this, we are going to be using our vehicle repository. And for the converter, we are going to, of course, be using the vehicle converter. And yeah, the only thing that's left is to inject them. So we have to use the auto-wired annotation to inject the repository and the converter, and then we are just going the super, so basically this part here. And now we can implement our update entity here method. So what we are doing here is we are taking the properties from the DTO and setting it to the entity. Set number, so in our case it's just a number, and from the DTO get number. And that's it. If we had more properties, which we probably will have in the future, we're just going to be adding them here, so the vehicle specific properties. But if we have something that's like generic, so something that's common for all of the entities, we are going to be doing it here. And yeah, so in this video, I think we did enough. We can stop it, and in the next one we are going to be creating our controllers, so we can finally give it a try and see if our application works. We're probably going to do in the next video just without the front end, and then in one of the next videos we're going to do it together in the front end, so we're going to create components for this. Great, so hopefully you liked this video, and if you have any questions or if something was unclear, please do leave a comment, and then I will try to explain it as soon as I can, so as soon as I get to that. Great, so if you like it, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel for the more content like this one, and I will see you in the next one.